Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. First, real quickly, I'd like to say thank you to Pammy Hammy, our newest monthly subscriber on our Buy Me a Coffee page. Thank you so much, Pammy Hammy, for the generosity. It is, as always, very much appreciated. The page is buymeacoffee.com/TribunusPlebis. All links are in the description wherever you are hearing this. Today, we are going to talk about the origins and the meaning of a holiday celebrated across the globe as May Day, which is also sometimes known more officially and I think more properly as International Workers' Day. May Day, which is celebrated on May 1st, is, for the folks here in the United States, essentially the same thing as what we call Labor Day here, which we celebrate in September, but there are some differences. It's a day to celebrate the labor movement, workers, and everything that we have brought into the world. And, like I said, it's not quite the same thing, but I guess it's kind of similar. The reasons why May Day and Labor Day are different will be explored a little bit later in this episode, so stay tuned. May Day, International Workers' Day, is important to the world for many reasons, but the core of that importance lies in looking back into the not-so-distant past and remembering that the workers of that time, especially around the turn of the 20th century, they decided together as a class to put aside their tools, to refrain from wage labor, and to simply exist, free and unencumbered amongst their friends and family for at least one single day without the permission of their masters, and to recognize the deeply revolutionary aspect that such a small act contained within it. It is also to remember the literal and bloody battles that were fought for things as simple as, living past the age of 30 or 40 years. And maybe even seeing your children grow up into adults, and keeping your children from having to mine at the age of 10 rather than playing in the fields. May Day is perhaps the only major holiday that was self-created and self-actualized by a mass movement of the proletariat, the working class, the poor, the too proud to take it anymore, and, it wasn't created by a government, church, or corporate goons. Labor Day, as celebrated in the United States, is basically just a day for picnics and beer. And I don't say that to mock, picnics and hot dogs and beer and all that, but only to note that the meaning of the day has been stripped from it, not just by constant propaganda, but also by the move down the calendar. I do hope that if we can understand the history of this day, which is both the most venerated of secular holidays not based on nationalism, and also the most tragically misunderstood, then we will see that this holiday is deeply important. Historian Eric Hobsbawm said this, quote, "The priests have their festivals, the moderates have their festivals. The 1st of May is the festival of the workers of the entire world." End quote. Hobsbawm also wrote this in his essay, 1st of May, which I found in a journal called On the Move, Essays in Labor and Transport History, presented by Philip Bagwell and John Shepard. Quote, "But it came from below. It was shaped by anonymous working people themselves who, through it, recognized themselves, across lines of occupation, language, even nationality, as a single class by deciding, once a year, deliberately not to work, to flout the moral, political, and economic compulsion to labor. As Victor Adler put it in 1893, this is the sense of the May Day holiday, of the rest from work, which our adversaries fear. This is what they feel to be revolutionary." End quote. The very idea that taking an extra day to rest from work is the very concept which our adversaries fear. That alone, the fact that the willingness to simply not participate in deeply abusive and exploitative wage labor for just a single day is revolutionary, is an absolute absurdity. No factory, no country, no world should exist in this sort of paradigm. After all, if just choosing not to work even when it makes your bosses mad, is the white-hot molten core of working-class power, of proletarian strength, then it must be tapped and flexed at all opportunities. Refusing to submit to exploitation, even if for just that one day, and doing it by choice and doing it en masse, is the ultimate expression of class solidarity and struggle. Even above all of that were the sudden explosions, both literal and figurative, which created May Day. The movement was both created and ignited by individuals who banded together to leave this amazing, indelible, and historic mark stamped across the last 130 or so years of our shared history. May Day, and even the American Labor Day, do not exist due to the singular acts of super charismatic individuals, or the machinations of a small group of people, nor the acts of an organization. May Day and Labor Day exist because individuals, workers, laborers, husbands, wives, and the unemployed can gather together, express their power from the bottom up, and leave for their descendants, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren and so on of these people long forgotten. They can leave them a legacy that belongs to none of them individually, but rather to all of us collectively. May Day and Labor Day are the fruits of trees planted by men and women who would never sit in their shade, and then nurtured by those who would never pick their fruit, and tended by those who would one day pluck that fruit and hand the seeds to their own children. Now, as we go forward, for the purposes of this episode, I will focus on May Day rather than the American Labor Day, though the latter will make an appearance here and there. And I will always refer to the May 1st holiday as May Day or International Workers' Day, and the American holiday in September as Labor Day, and I'm going to do that just to avoid confusion. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, as with most history episodes, I find it difficult to really decide where specifically to start these things. We could rewind this, right back to the founding of this country, even back into the colony days and right back into England and so on. But the first thing I'm going to bring up here is just generally the late 1700s. Yeah, that's a fairly big span of time, but we only need to hit a few highlights here. It was at this time that workers began trying to get 10 and even sometimes 12-hour workdays in their industries. Yes, some industries and workplaces at this time were demanding 14-hour workdays from their workers. Occasionally, some places demanded even more than that, as 16-hour days were not unheard of. Some workers did band together in trade groups and unions, and some even managed to get working hours lowered. But 10 and 12-hour days were mostly the norm right into the 1800s. And yes, there's a lot being left out here of the earliest possible labor organizing history of the United States. This is, the bare bones of it because the meat of this subject really happens in the mid and late 1800s. And hello there, everybody. As most of you probably know, this podcast takes a lot of time and effort to put together and, to get out there for you good folks to listen to. And you, our listeners, can help us by liking and subscribing on YouTube. So please take a second to click those little buttons. It helps a ton. And if you are feeling just a little bit more generous and you enjoy what we do here at Tribunus Plebis Media, you can help us earn just a little bit of money for the large amount of labor that we put into this thing by signing up on our Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can make a one-time donation or sign up for a recurring monthly subscription. We do all of this for free, and we will never run ads in our works. But any contributions really do help keep the show going and improving. The page address is buymeacoffee.com/Tribunus Plebis. And of course, all links will be in the show notes and descriptions wherever you are listening or watching. Thank you. And now, back to the episode. Now I'm going to be a little provincial here and focus on the United States because I was born and raised here and this is what I know more than anything else. I'm not intentionally trying to leave anything out that happened anywhere else in the world, but this holiday is in fact inextricably linked to this country in many ways. It is truly one of the great historic remnants that the early militant labor movement of the United States in many ways gave to the world. The real roots of May Day belong to the 8-hour movement of the 19th century. The first real battle in the war for 8 hours was fought in Chicago on May 1st of 1867, when striking workers shut down the entire city economy for a full week before it collapsed under the weight of the state. This strike is possibly the inspiration for the selection of May 1st as the date of International Workers' Day, but it is in some dispute. And while it very well may be the inspiration for the date, it's not truly the inspiration for the day itself. But we will get to all of that very soon. So this working hours fight really started to come to a head in the 1850s and 60s. In fact, the earliest mass strike with real influence that I was able to find is a fairly famous strike of stonemasons and other construction workers in Australia that took place in June of 1856. Those workers marched from University of Melbourne, where they were working, to the Parliament House demanding an 8-hour day. The results were a clear victory, and either the first ever winning of the 8-hour day as a standard outright, or perhaps the first 8-hour workday win with no reduction in pay. Which it is, the first 8-hour day, or the first 8-hour day without a pay cut, is unclear to me. But regardless, they won, and it was a historic labor win. A win which made news on a global scale, and it was a direct, even if slightly delayed inspiration for the ongoing international and American 8-hour day efforts. Meanwhile, back here in the States, 10, 12, and yes, 16 hours were still the norm. The conditions were hellish, both in their danger and the sheer amount of death which resulted from them. In fact, industry had continually become more and more dangerous as the Industrial Revolution firmly took hold across the country. Karl Marx wrote the following in his magnum opus, Das Kapital. Quote, "By extending the working day, therefore, capitalist production not only produces a deterioration of the human labor power by robbing it of its normal moral and physical conditions of development and activity, but also produces the premature exhaustion and death of this labor power itself." End quote. Workers were exhausted, downtrodden, beaten, destitute, and abused. The few small craft unions of the time were not up to the challenge presented by the capitalist ownership class, and often operated as little more than facilitators of racial gatekeeping, which perpetuated a system of white people getting the less onerous and higher-paying jobs and forcing immigrants and blacks to do the most dangerous, most demeaning, and lowest-paying jobs. And this was the 19th century version of the definition of white people, which included basically people from England, native-born Americans, and fully assimilated Americans, and basically little else. Irish, Italian, German, and so on immigrants, or not fully integrated people from those groups, were definitely not a part of the club, especially if they weren't born here. It was into this splintered mess of labor organizing that the NLU, the National Labor Union, was born. It was the first fully nationwide labor organization in the country when it was formed in 1866. There had been a few attempts to create nationwide coalitions of various trade unions before, but none had gotten off the ground for a variety of reasons. But the NLU was able to actually launch and begin to organize workers. However, it didn't last very long, just 7 years. But along the way, it brought into its embrace many smaller unions, and most importantly for our story here, various local and regional versions of what were called 8-hour leagues. 8-hour leagues were created to strategize, publicize, and fight for a national standard of an 8-hour workday, a truly ambitious goal at the time. The NLU operated much as we think of unions now, collectively bargaining, fighting for labor rules, laws, and reforms, stuff like that, as well as attempting to create a national political labor party. They, like many early unions, did not like the idea of labor strikes at all. They almost universally favored the concept of negotiations and arbitration at their founding. The NLU did in fact win a few fights, but their inherent weakness in their anti-Chinese racism and their racist indifference to the plight of Black Americans post-Civil War should not be ignored. This racism and reticence to fight hard, let alone be revolutionary, coupled with a slide into straight electoralism as a means for change, left their members wanting as the 1870s approached. That declining membership would largely find a new home in the newly formed Knights of Labor, especially during the 1870s Depression era. Now, before we get to the Knights of Labor here, I want to mention the Civil War, or really, I guess, the aftermath of it. Coming out of the war, we had not just a bunch of freed slaves who needed work, and there's a whole boatload of horrible stuff that happened to these former slaves, which we aren't going to cover here. And we could talk about work stoppages on plantations as well. I'm not trying to blithely, skip over all of that. I'm just trying to stay kind of focused on the goal here. So it wasn't just the influx of suddenly available workers. It was also the knowledge and systemic abuse of human beings that the slaveholders had created for the previous several hundred years. Slavers would track, to the decimal point, the production of their human so-called property. Hours worked, weight of cotton produced, that sort of thing. The same sorts of details that northern factory owners would track on their own. And I'm not saying in any way that white workers were akin to chattel slaves, by the way. I just want to be clear about that. But these systems crept from plantations into the factories of the South and eventually all across the country as these wealthy white slave owners began to take their immense wealth and invest it in new industrial realms while they brought their overseer ways with them. Workers at this time had very few legal protections in any realm of work, but industrial and semi-industrial realms were particularly bereft of lawful defense, especially in work considered to be unskilled. Unorganized workers were forced to rely on the benevolent protection of their employers, a protection which simply did not exist at the time, and the bare truth of this fact should just reinforce just how many human beings that the capitalist class will watch suffer and die in pursuit of maximal profits if left to their own devices. The compassion of employers goes about as far as they can spit, if not forced into it by law or by the organized working class firmly pressing weapons to their soft necks. The post-war era can be used as a clear and poignant example of what owners are willing to do when there is a lack of laws, but also what happens when the laws that do exist favor the prioritization of property over the well-being of human beings. The dichotomy of this era can also be used to highlight how Marx became so important amongst the American labor movement of the time. The rift between classes was as apparent as it ever could be, even to the most uneducated workers in the country. It did not have to be pointed out to them for them to see it, but it did on occasion need to be explained as far as core concepts go. The difference between knowing something exists and truly understanding why and how it exists is, I think, more profound than many realize. To focus a little Marxist lens upon the obvious was all it took to stimulate a nascent consciousness of their class and to make it much easier to organize them under explicitly militant organizations and unions. In fact, Marx wrote this in Capital regarding the end of slavery following the Civil War. Quote, "In the United States of America, any sort of independent labor movement was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the Republic. Labor with a white skin cannot emancipate itself where labor with a black skin is branded. But out of the death of slavery, a new vigorous life sprang. The first fruit of the Civil War was an agitation for the 8-hour day, a movement which ran with express speed from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New England to California." End quote. He also wrote this back in 1847, published in Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung newspaper. Quote, "Nowhere does social inequality obtrude itself more harshly than in the eastern states of North America, because it is nowhere less glossed over by political inequality." End quote. So this was the situation where the NLU failed and the Knights of Labor sprang forth. The Knights were actually originally formed by a group of tailors based in Philadelphia as a secret society, the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor. And this is what the group was when the NLU began its collapse a year later. The secret society had grown on its own, but the NLU sent men seeking help right into their arms, and they soon rebranded as a labor organization, and they would be acting fully in that role within a couple of years. organizing, negotiating, and politicking, and the like. The Knights were a pretty open union at the time, which was unique. Anybody could join so long as they weren't bankers, land speculators, lawyers, liquor dealers, or gamblers. This included black men and even Asians, though the Knights would definitely have some issues regarding race in their run as the premier labor organization in this country. As an example of this, the Knights were vocal and stringent supporters of anti-Chinese immigration laws, and they were supporters of nativist agendas and anti-immigrant causes over the length of their existence. The Knights, however, were active in the 8-hour workday movement and did help make some headway here and there. However, the leader at the time, Terence V. Powderly, was dead set against strikes and against a more radical vision of unionism in the United States. He was very much in line with the ideas espoused by the NLU, negotiations with ownership and compromise with capital. Despite the Knights featuring the following as part of their preamble to their constitution, they never put much effort into actually making the changes that they supposedly demanded. The preamble in part said this, quote, "The reduction of the hours of labor to 8 hours per day, so the laborers may have more time for social enjoyment and intellectual improvements and be enabled to reap the enjoyment and intellectual improvement and be enabled to reap the advantages conferred by the labor-saving machinery which their brains have created." End quote. Through the early 1880s, the Knights used legislative pressure to achieve their goals, and they generally failed. The lasting impact of the Knights on Labor Day, the American Labor Day, exists from 1882 when the Knights led a parade of labor organizations on September 5th under the CLU, the Central Labor Union of New York. It was here, around this time, that two men with similar sounding names, Matthew McGuire, Maguire, Secretary of the CLU, and C.S. McGuire, MCGUIRE, a Vice President of the American Federation of Labor, are both given credit for being the first true invoker of the term Labor Day. There's no way to tell who was first, or even if both actually did what their grandchildren claim. Yes, as far as I can tell, there is no evidence from the time which exists, though some documentation does exist that a September holiday was called for in a more general sense around that time. They both apparently presented September as an ideal time of the year, with McGuire, MC McGuire, claiming to have suggested the first Monday of the month, the format we follow even today. In 1881, delegates from multiple craft unions came together to form the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada, an absolute mouthful of a name. And they joined other groups in making real but futile pushes to get the government to enforce the largely ignored national 8-hour law passed in 1868. I did not mention the law to this point because while it did exist on paper, it was literally never enforced and businesses simply ignored it to absolutely no problems at all. By 1884, even Samuel Gompers was starting to get on board and support a Federation resolution put forward by George Edmonton, the founder and president of the Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners. It read, quote, "Resolved, that 8 hours shall constitute a legal day's labor from and after May 1st, 1886, and that we recommend to labor organizers throughout this district that they so direct their laws to conform to this resolution by the time named." End quote. This is one of the genesis points for International Workers' Day. It's not positively known exactly why May 1st was chosen, but there is a theory that it was because the traditional May Day, the one with the maypoles and dancing and spring festivities, was often the day that seasonal workers would get together to compel employers to sign new contracts that conformed to union wages, a benefit they lost over the winter when so many became unemployed. More likely, it may have been a reference to that May 1st strike in Chicago in 1867 that I mentioned earlier, where they were fighting for the 8 hours day and shut down the city's economy for a full week. And now, my friends, we are going to roll forward just a little bit to 1886 in the Haymarket Affair and Martyrs, the most exciting part of this entire story. It is at this point that the struggle for 8 hours, and really the struggles for many other labor concerns, just small stuff, things like not dying at work, things like not being maimed at work, things like raises, sick time, and everything else, these struggles all came to a head. And yes, the 8-hour fight was still in full swing. In fact, it was the primary issue addressed with the May 1st strike, which led to Haymarket. In 1885, the Federation of Unions had repeated their calls to labor unions to demand 8-hour days for their contracts starting on May 1st of 1886. While the Knights largely cowered, other unions all across the country began to agitate for May 1st of 1886, preparing their members for a strike, preparing them to picket, and even preparing fellow travelers' families in local areas by disseminating circulars, flyers, printing papers, and knocking on doors. One circular said this, quote, "Arouse ye toilers of America, lay down your tools on May 1st, 1886. Ease your labor, close the factories, mills, and mines, for one day in the year. One day of revolt, not of rest. A day not ordained by the bragging spokesmen of institutions holding the world of labor in its bondage. A day on which labor makes its own laws and has the power to execute them. All without the consent and approval of those who oppress and rule. A day on which, in tremendous force, the unity of the army of toilers is arrayed against the powers that today hold sway over the destinies of the peoples of all nations. A day of protest against oppression and tyranny, against ignorance and war of any kind. A day on which to begin to enjoy 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will." End quote. May 1st was set to be more than just a day to demand things. It was here that Powderly sent out a message to his Knights of Labor members demanding that they do not participate in this strike. His members largely ignored the demand and would take part in the agitation, a series of events which effectively killed the union going forward as the membership lost faith and fled completely. The labor unions had been gaining support of anarchists and Marxists over the past 5 years, and those men and women began to help bring attention to the events of the day and would become a strong backbone of the movement where large organizations like the Knights began to falter and fail. Chicago and the other major cities were, in fact, covered from edge to edge with socialist and anarchist newspapers printed in every language with enough readers to support it, not to mention the work of the unions themselves. However, at this time, there was no union or group of unions or socialist or anarchist collectives large enough, well-funded enough, or well-organized enough to fully plan, organize, and coordinate a nationwide movement like this. So it fell to regional and local chapters of a vast multitude of unions, anarchist and Marxist groups, assemblies, and individuals to do the very best that they could. One thing was certain. By this time, the 8-hour movement was fully entrenched not just within labor, but within society at large. It permeated every aspect of working life for the workers and hung as a sword of Damocles over the heads of the capitalists. On the sidelines sat the power of the state, which was firmly on the side of capital, but wanted to do their best to not be involved. Not for any altruistic reasons, but rather to avoid being the bloody-handed bad guys in the public's eyes. Now, through the beginning of the year, large cities began to implement 8-hour days for municipal workers. Some industries began to install 8 or 9-hour workdays as well. Some unions even won the 8-hour day themselves. In January, for example, the Cigar Makers Union demanded and won a 9-hour day, and they did this in preparation to begin the fight for 8 hours on May 1st. And as a guy who enjoys a good cigar more often than not, I am always tickled that cigar makers were once a powerful and militant union force. But that's a bit of a digression. So the newspapers, the servers of capital, of course, railed against this movement, warning of communism and anarchism. Politicians, religious leaders, newspapers, and weirdos warned that an 8-hour day would lead to gambling, rioting, debauchery, and drunkenness, general social degradation. P.M. Arthur, chief of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Workers, said that 2 hours less work would just mean 2 hours more loafing and drinking, proving that not all labor unions were run by good people. As May 1st grew ever nearer in 1886, unions across the country ramped up the rhetoric and agitprop. Cities and states began to prepare for rioting, and capitalists began hiring private detectives like the Pinkertons to help break the looming strikes. On the morning of May 1st, 1886, hundreds of thousands of workers across the country refused to go to work, shutting down tens of thousands of businesses. They struck in big cities like New York and Boston, and in small cities like Duluth, Minnesota, and many dozens or hundreds of mill towns as far apart as Maine and Texas. But nowhere in this country did they strike quite like they did in Chicago. Around 100,000 people poured into the streets to demonstrate. 45,000 workers were on strike. The mass work stoppage shut down the entirety of industry in the city. Railroads, warehouses, slaughterhouses, everything was paralyzed. 80,000 people took part in what was probably the world's first May Day parade on Michigan Avenue. In the city's lumber yards, about 10,000 workers, mostly German and Polish, formed their own parade, a second massive parade in the city, and marched through the streets chanting. A Knights of Labor local shut down the stockyards and were almost immediately granted an 8-hour workday with no reduction in pay, essentially proving the strikers correct in what their unified power can mean. As the sun set on the very first unofficial May Day, it also set on the single biggest mass strike in the history of this country. As the sun rose over Chicago on May 2nd, the workers remained out of work and the city remained shut down and paralyzed, at least for the capitalists. The people continued their 250,000+ turnout in the streets, continuing the strikes, the marches, and the speeches. For a city that was prepared for bloodshed and mass rioting, the strikes thus far had proven to be as peaceful as they were popular. All of this took a dark turn the next day, May 3rd, at the McCormick Reaper Works. The McCormick plant, a massive sprawling facility that produced massive farm equipment, had been in the midst of a labor battle for several months before the 8-hour strike broke out. The strike was concerning safety, hours, and work quality, the normal stuff, and the company had been hiring Pinkerton agents for at least 6 months in an attempt to infiltrate, physically attack, and intimidate the workers into submission. But on May 3rd, open violence broke out between the strikers and the police and Pinkerton agents. The Metal Workers Union of Iron Molders was on the front line, and once the police moved in and began beating strikers with batons, the union men responded with thrown rocks and fists. The police responded, in turn, with gunfire. Many workers were injured, and at least 2 were killed. It was this bout of violence, this cold-blooded murder of their fellow strikers, fellow workers, and fellow human beings, that enraged those who heard about it. In response, the workers, and in particular the anarchist elements of the strike, and by the way, the Metal Workers Union was an anarchist stronghold, it inspired them to call for a large meeting to be held in the Chicago Haymarket, which is quite literally what it sounded like, a large square where hay was bought and sold. Now, Haymarket. This is an extremely important part of this story, so I'm going to go into a little more deep detail than some of the previous events, but I'm going to leave a fair bit out for brevity's sake and to keep the podcast centered on May Day. The square at the time was, of course, mostly empty due to the strikes, a perfect place to gather for a meeting. And so the stage was set for one of the most significant events in the history of organized labor in the United States of America. The weather on the 4th was dismal and rainy, and a small fraction of the amount of people expected actually showed up. The crowd was about 3,000 people versus the expected tens of thousands. Amongst the crowd were families with children and even the mayor of Chicago. Scheduled to speak were August Spies, Albert Parsons, and the Reverend Samuel Fielden. The speakers set up a wagon to stand on so that their voices could be heard across the square. Spies spoke first and urged those in attendance to remain peaceful. Quote, "There seems to prevail the opinion in some quarters that this meeting has been called for the purpose of inaugurating a riot. Hence these warlike preparations on the part of the so-called law and order. However, let me tell you at the beginning that this meeting has not been called for any such purpose. The object of this meeting is to explain the general situation of the 8-hour movement and to throw light upon various incidents in connection with it." End quote. The rally would remain peaceful even as the weather deteriorated. After Spies, Albert Parsons spoke for about an hour before giving the stage over to the Reverend Fielden. At some point during Parsons' speech, the mayor had decided that everything was peaceful, told the police not to interfere, and walked home. And by the start of Fielden's speech, much of the crowd had departed as the rain began to fall even more heavily. As Fielden spoke, Pinkerton detectives who were present left the Haymarket and began speaking with the police who were in the area and told them that the Haymarket speakers had been inciting violence with their speeches. Something in the vicinity of 150 police officers brandished their clubs and moved into the square and surrounded the wagon which had served as a stage and began pushing the remaining onlookers away from the wagon and out of the Haymarket. It was at this moment that a dynamite bomb pinwheeled through the air and landed amongst the ranks of the police. It detonated, killing possibly one officer and possibly injuring a few more. I say possibly because while one cop died at the scene and 7 more would eventually die from their wounds, only one of the deaths has been plausibly linked to the bomb. The rest of the deaths, surprising to probably nobody at all if you listen to this podcast, were more than likely caused by the police's own panicked, frantic, and indiscriminate gunfire in all directions. To bolster this claim, the Chicago Tribune published this quote from a police officer who wished to remain anonymous. Quote, "A very large number of the police were wounded by each other's revolvers. It was every man for himself, and while some got 2 or 3 squares away, the rest emptied their revolvers, mainly into each other." End quote. I will say that it is certainly possible that some number of workers were armed and fired at the police, but by most serious accounts, the numbers were small if they did indeed exist. Nobody knows precisely how many civilians were wounded, but we know that at least 4 workers were killed in the chaotic firing of police revolvers. In fact, aside from the bomb, and I am aware that that is a rather large aside, it was really the police who committed the majority of the violence and the far deadlier violence that day. Nobody knew who threw the bomb on May 4th. In fact, it is a mystery even to this day. The workers blamed an agent provocateur, and the police in Capitol blamed the anarchists. The reality is, like I said, nobody really knows. But I'm not going to, pretend here that the anarchists aren't the most likely culprit. Going back to May 1st, the first day of the strike, the Chicago Mail had this to say about Spies and Parsons, who they referred to as ruffians, dangerous, and encouraging disorder. Quote, "Mark them for today. Keep them in view. Hold them personally responsible for any trouble that occurs. Make an example of them if trouble occurs." End quote. On the morning of May 5th, Mayor Harrison made good on the urgings of not just the Mail, but also George Pullman, Cyrus McCormick Jr., and dozens of other local powerful wealthy businessmen. He declared martial law as the sun rose and unleashed the police on the city's citizens. The state attorney general even went so far as to tell the police to simply ignore the law as they went about their raids and violent retributions. The anti-union, anti-worker, anti-socialist, and anti-anarchist sweep resulted in the arrest of hundreds of people and warrantless searches of dozens of homes and dozens of union and socialist spaces and offices. Historian Harvey Wish has written that, quote, "Suspects were beaten and subjected to the 3rd degree. Individuals ignorant of the meaning of socialism or anarchism were tortured by the police, sometimes bribed as well to act as witnesses for the state." End quote. Of those hundreds of arrests, 31 men were indicted, and of those 31 men, 8 of them were chosen to stand trial for their supposed crimes. Those men were Albert Parsons, August Spies, Adolf Fischer, George Engel, Louis Ling, Samuel Fielden, Michael Schwab, and Oswald Neebe. Now you might be wondering to yourselves about which one or which collection of them actually did it. And the answer here might be shocking. None of them did it. In fact, 5 of these men hadn't even attended the Haymarket on the 4th. They weren't even there. Of the 3 who remained and were present at the Haymarket, 1 had gone to a social club before the bomb was thrown, and the other 2, Spies and Fielden, were clearly not where the bomb had come from. Both were in the process of actually climbing down from the wagon that they spoke from and following police orders to leave the square. Fisher and Parsons, meanwhile, had been present for some of the Haymarket meeting, but had left early and had been relaxing at a well-known anarchist haven called Zeph's Hall. Michael Schwab had been speaking at an entirely separate event across the city at the time of the bombing. But this didn't matter at all because these men weren't arrested for throwing a bomb or even for inciting violence, and not even for having fought back against the cops, none of which they did, by the way. They were arrested for a crime with even greater significance for the city of Chicago, the country of the United States, and the capitalist world at large. All 8 of these men were preeminent labor organizers, 8-hour champions, and the militant intellectual spark plugs of a citywide movement, and all had national pull due to their fame. As an example, the year before the Haymarket massacre, Samuel Fielden pointed out in the anarchist newspaper The Alarm that whether a man works 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, he is still a slave. This is the true reason that they were hunted down, arrested, indicted, and put on trial. Not for crimes, but for uniting the working class and urging it to fight back against capital tyranny. This can be backed up by the arrest of George Engel, who had nothing at all to do with Haymarket, and Oscar Neebe, who was only attempting to revive a socialist German-language paper in Chicago. The trial itself was rigged from the start, and that's not an exaggeration. The judge was actively hostile to the defendants and made a show of it. The entire jury was made of prominent business leaders who openly professed their distaste for the defendants, yet were allowed to sit for the trial. The evidence was shoddy at best, and even that is a stretch. All but 2 of the defendants were provably not even at the site of the bombing, and the other 2 who were present were in plain view standing on a wagon nowhere near the explosion or where the bomb came from. All 8 of these men were convicted. Parsons, Engel, Fisher, and Spies were hung to death on November 11th of 1887. Ling would take his own life using an explosive device in his own mouth. The remaining defendants, Fielden, Neebe, and Schwab, would eventually be pardoned by the governor Altgeld over 6 years later. The governor would decry the judge for the sham trial and for the obvious travesty of justice it was. This was 6 years too late for the martyrs of Haymarket. In the immediate aftermath of Haymarket, the big business interest of Chicago ran what was perhaps the first and certainly the most coordinated Red Scare in this country. The nationalities of the defendants, 6 German and 2 British, set the stereotype of violent anarchists. Eastern European extremists tossing bombs as they run through the bucolic countryside. And it helped set the propaganda of anarchism, socialism, and Marxism as deeply un-American. This, in turn, given the connection of American labor with socialism at the time, began to set the labor movement as un-American in and of itself. Quote, "The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today." End quote. Those are the final words of August Spies before he was hung from his neck until dead, and they are the very words carved into the Haymarket Memorial in Chicago to this very day. After Haymarket, several cities across the country declared the first Monday in September as a workers' holiday, and on February 21st, 1887, Oregon became the first state in the Union to recognize a Labor Day officially. Multiple other states, including Massachusetts and New York, would follow later that year. But this was the American version of Labor Day, and it really didn't do much, to be honest. So the struggle went on. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours to do as we please. And the struggle was recognized internationally as well. In 1889, on July 4th, just a little over 3 years after Haymarket, and on the 100th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, the Second Socialist International was held in Paris as leaders from various revolutionary and proletarian movements from multiple countries met in an effort to organize workers across borders. It was here that delegates from the States spoke to audiences about the struggles going on in their country for the 8-hour day and the various strikes and battles which had been fought, but specifically the events of Haymarket and the death of her martyrs 18 months previous. Inspired by the fight of the Americans, a resolution was presented and it was adopted by the Parisian Congress. It read, quote, "The Congress decides to organize a great international demonstration so that in all countries and in all cities on one appointed day, the toiling masses shall demand of the state authorities the legal reduction of the working day to 8 hours, as well as the carrying out of other decisions of the Paris Congress. Since a similar demonstration has already been decided upon for May 1st, 1890, by the American Federation of Labor at its convention in St. Louis, December 1888, this day is accepted for the international demonstration. The workers of the various countries must organize their demonstration according to conditions prevailing in each country." End quote. Now, this resolution was not meant to be a yearly event for generations to come. It was a single event on a particular day, May 1st of a particular year, 1890. But it became more than that, as I think we all know right now. It became International Workers' Day. Now, I want to share with you a few quotes from some prominent socialists and leaders of the time. Friedrich Engels, writing a preface to the 4th German edition of the Communist Manifesto on May 1st of 1890, the first official May Day, wrote this about the significance of the date. Quote, "As I write these lines, the proletariat of Europe and America is holding a review of its forces. It is mobilized for the first time as one army, under one bag, and fighting one immediate aim, an 8-hour working day established by legal enactment. The spectacle we are now witnessing will make the capitalists and landowners of all lands realize that today the proletarians of all lands are, in very truth, united. If only Marx were with me to see it with his own eyes." End quote. Karl Marx had passed away in 1883, 7 years previous. Rosa Luxemburg would write the following for May Day in 1913. Quote, "The brilliant chief idea of the May Day celebration is the independent action of the proletarian masses, and the political mass action of the millions of workers. The excellent purpose of the Frenchman Levine at the International Congress in Paris, combined with the direct international mass manifestation, the laying down of tools, is a demonstration and fighting tactic for the 8-hour day, world peace, and socialism." End quote. In 1896, Lenin, while in prison, wrote a May Day essay for the St. Petersburg Union of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class, one of the first Marxist political groups in Russia. Quote, "In France, England, Germany, and other countries where workers have already been united in powerful unions and have won for themselves many rights, they organized on April 19th, and just a little aside here, he says April 19th here. This is May 1st on the Western calendar. The Russian calendar was 14 days, I think, behind ours. But it is May 1st, as we think of it anyway. They organized on April 19th a general holiday of labor, leaving the stifling factories a march with unfurled banners to the strains of music along the main streets of the cities, demonstrating to the bosses their continuously growing power. They assemble at great mass demonstrations where speeches are made recounting the victories over the bosses during the preceding year and lay plans for struggle in the future. Under the threat of strike, the bosses do not dare to fine the workers for not appearing at the factories on that day. On this day, the workers also remind the bosses of their main demand: 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, and 8 hours recreation. This is what the workers of other countries are demanding now." End quote. So meanwhile, back in the United States, the battle continued. In 1894, the workers at Pullman Palace Car, a maker of train cars based outside of Chicago, went on a massive strike which shut down railroads not only in the Midwest but across the country. This strike not only set the workers against George Pullman and his Pinkerton goons, but also against the federal government of the United States led by President Grover Cleveland. Basically, what happened was Pullman slashed wages but refused to cut prices in the company towns he forced his workers to live in, and they were not having any of that crap, so they struck. The strike lasted for 2 months until Cleveland sent in the troops. Thousands of U.S. Marshals and about 12,000 Army troops led by General Nelson Miles arrived in Chicago. The violence that the military and the Marshals brought resulted in the deaths of over 70 workers, 57 badly injured workers, and several arrests. Property damage was in excess of $30 million. The damage can also be tallied in another way. The strike scared the bejesus out of the capitalists and politicians and the powerful elites. The bourgeoisie were on their heels, at least as it comes to fear of an uprising. And it was in the aftermath of this strike and all of its death and destruction that President Cleveland, in a desperate attempt to deflect working class rage, declared the first Monday in September a federal holiday, but it only applied to federal workers. This declaration came on June 28th, while the Pullman strike still raged. It wasn't until 6 days after the end of the strike that Cleveland amended the order and declared Labor Day a general national holiday to be honored by all workers. So now, why the first Monday in September? Why not May Day like the rest of the world? Well, first we can acknowledge that there was some level of historical precedence here. The two McGuire labor leaders in New York had proposed a September holiday many years ago, and it had remained a popular choice mostly due to the pleasantness of the weather typical of that month, even in the industrial North. Several states had already created a September Labor Day as well. But the decision was really based on something else. It was a desire to sever the working class of the United States from a holiday, May Day, with very deep anarchist and socialist roots, not to mention its connection to enormous general strikes, labor organizing, and militancy. The moving of the holiday as far away from May as possible helped obscure the militant origins of the holiday and deflected interest in more radical critiques of the country, things like anarchism and socialism. And we shouldn't pass by this decision to make Labor Day in September without mentioning Samuel Gompers. He was the leader of the American Federation of Labor and was fully behind the president's decision. Gompers endorsed the plan in an obvious bending of the knee to capital and political power. So don't think Gompers was a hero because he worked in the labor movement. He was not. By simply declaring this day as a day for workers to throw parties, it hides much of the history which led to it, and I think that we can all see that here by how so few people in our lives even know why we celebrate Labor Day, even in a very broad general sense, let alone what lies at its core. Never mind how many of our coworkers don't even know that May Day or International Workers' Day even exists. And this is not the only direct attack designed to erase May Day from the American memory either. The first official one was in 1921 during the first Red Scare when May 1st was declared to be a new holiday. They called this new holiday Americanization Day. Yes, that's a real fact. Americanization Day. It's not even easy to say. It would eventually be renamed as Loyalty Day during the second Red Scare and exists to this day, and yes, that is also a true fact. Also during the second Red Scare, and both of these second Red Scare holidays were put into law by Eisenhower, by the way, another holiday was created for May 1st in yet another attempt to divert attention away from International Labor Day. That new holiday is called Law Day, a day to celebrate law and order. Yes, this one is also real, and yes, it still exists. Yet even after all of this nonsense, May Day, as an international day to celebrate labor, persists. It exists as an official national holiday in at least 65 countries, and it is unofficially celebrated in dozens more. Yet in the United States, we rarely hear it mentioned, let alone recognized, and this is the country in which it began. The American Labor Day has been defanged, domesticated, and hidden behind grilled burgers and cheap beer and a focus on the turning of the seasons. the last big holiday before children return to school, before the weather gets too cold, and it has become a moment to rest before the long run of work and school days before Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, and Christmas during the winter holiday season. But the history is stripped of it, as is any reference to May 1st, and history here can really teach us about the roots of American labor, about its strength, its militancy, and what it can accomplish against all odds. Instead of just another day eating and enjoying our friends and family, and I don't want to talk down on that, relaxation and family time is super important for us human beings, but perhaps we could retake May 1st and the radical history which it represents. Peter Limbaugh summed this up quite well in his book, The Incomplete, True, Authentic, and Wonderful History of May Day, when he said, quote, "The principle of national patriotism was used against the principle of working class unity or trade union unity." End quote. We can take a few moments every May 1st, every May Day, and remember all the workers who were shot by armed thugs and U.S. soldiers just for trying to create a world where children didn't need to mine coal or work in incredibly dangerous factories all across the country. We can take a few minutes to reflect on all of the nameless, long-forgotten men and women who were violently beaten with clubs for daring to demand an 8-hour workday. We can talk about the tent camps of striking miners that were literally machine-gunned by Pinkerton agents, and the strikers at Blair Mountain who were literally bombed from airplanes by corporate mercenary pilots. Or we could honor all the thousands of people who marched through hundreds of cities and towns to demand healthier, more meaningful lives for themselves, their children, and the countless generations of the future. And we can remember, perhaps most importantly of all, that our current conditions, as bad as we can see that they are 1,000 times better than they would have been without these labor heroes, many of whom we will never be able to celebrate individually, but we damn sure can celebrate them collectively. On May Day, International Workers' Day, every single year. We can even talk about one of May Day's most important inherent characteristics. It is a representation of hope. Hope for the downtrodden, the exploited, and the uncared for. Hope that things can get better because people in the past forced things to improve by working together, collectively, to make the world just a little bit better. Just a little bit here and there, in fits and starts, but better it was made. And hope that there can be more in the future. There is still a lot more to fight for. The sacrifices of our past heroes cannot be ignored, forgotten, or allowed to be whitewashed from our collective histories. If we dare forget the sacrifice, the pain, the blood, the anguish, and yes, even the rapturous victories and glories, then we will be doomed to fight those same battles once again. This is why we must never forget. This is why we celebrate May Day. I will leave you with a Rosa Luxemburg quote from a letter she wrote celebrating May Day. Quote, "But even after this goal was reached, May Day was not given up. As long as the struggles of the workers against the bourgeoisie and the ruling class continues, as long as all demands are not met, May Day will be the yearly expression of these demands. And when better days dawn, when the working class of the world has won its deliverance, then too humanity will probably celebrate May Day in honor of the bitter struggles and the many sufferings of the past." End quote. And that, my friends, was a brief, kind of long, I guess, and yet still incomplete history of International Workers' Day, aka May Day. I hope some of you learned something new, whether it was most of the episode or just a few tidbits found within it. Please never forget the past. Thank you all. I love you very much. Bye.